drop in the ocean compared to the well over 100,000 refugees that have come into Albania in the last few days.
As you say, people working with aid agencies are distributing food and water, although of course they haven't got enough. We've heard today that some flights have already left, many more are planned. What, apart from the shock of course, is the general health of these people?
It's amazing. When you look at their faces, and I have to say that it's difficult to look at their faces because in some way you feel guilty because you can't help them. You look at their faces and you see that they're almost cheerful. That's probably some kind of sense of relief that they've crossed the border. There are tears, of course, but in the main, they look happy, they look sturdy, they look determined. And perhaps that's because many of them have been bussed up to the border and they're hearing horrific stories on the Kosovan side of concentration camps and threats to kill people. So perhaps they think they're going to be killed. When they find out they're simply being turfed over the border, perhaps the expression we're seeing on their faces is one of relief.
Ross Appleyard reporting for us from Albania. Thank you.
Well, Sky's Keith Graves is with the refugees massing at Blace on the border with Macedonia. He's on the line now. Keith, we were just hearing many of these refugees, most in fact, have no identification with them. How are the Macedonians particularly able to process them, and is there the will to process them in the first place?
There's the will to process them, but it's a very, very, very slow.
British people now support the idea of sending ground troops to Yugoslavia. 58% backed the use of ground forces, while 34% were opposed and 8% were undecided.
They wait to enforce a peace deal, not to fight for one. Thousands of British troops are stationed close to the Kosovo border, but since the start of NATO's airstrikes, military planners have insisted there will be no ground assault. Yet British public opinion may be losing faith in that strategy. The latest opinion poll shows support for the use of ground troops, and some military experts believe that's becoming inevitable.
One saw even a few years ago in Bosnia that there was no real effect or no real pressure on the Serbs until you actually had ground troops and an effective ground force at the time. And to try and police with just aircraft is just simply not on.
The poll in today's Guardian newspaper also suggests hardening attitudes towards the conflict, with a growing majority backing Britain's role in the airstrikes. That will please NATO planners, although again they're stressing there is no alternative to the aerial bombardment.
Ground troops are not something that are a practical proposition. We would need a lot of people. It would take a long time to assemble those people, to get them into the area before they could be employed in Kosovo.
Officials here view opinion polls with great caution, knowing support could easily be shattered by one military setback. And there's less confidence the public would tolerate the casualties that would inevitably follow a ground assault. John Ray, Sky News at the Ministry of Defence.
A massive international response has been triggered to deal with what's swiftly becoming a major humanitarian crisis. A British plane is on its way to Macedonia, packed with emergency aid for the tens of thousands of ethnic Albanians fleeing Kosovo.
As the scale of the refugee crisis is unfolding, the aid agencies are stepping up their efforts. Overnight, a huge cargo plane laden with 20 tons of aid took off from Stansted Airport. Oxfam's sending 10 water tanks. Each one can hold 10,000 litres.
Water is a basic need. I mean, people can provide without, they can manage without food, they cannot manage without water. It's also the underpinning of people's health.
Desperately needed clothes, food and blankets have been arriving in the Balkans from across the world. Charities have been asking British firms to donate products. Across the country, in warehouses like this one, the relief effort is gaining pace. Many companies are donating products they know are desperately needed in the Balkans. Many of those products are needed for babies and for children.
The products we're going to send are things like nappies here and wipes to keep the child clean. There's a problem with water, so these are the reasons we're sending this type of product. We're also sending products like layers of clothing like bodysuits and sleep suits so that the child can be kept warm.
But it will be at least Tuesday before they arrive with the people who need them. The charities say they also need cash donations to help to pay for the relief effort. Keir Simmons, Sky News.
And here's a reminder of the headlines on Sky News today.
About it. But they're under pressure here because, or they're under difficulties here because this is Macedonian territory. It's the sovereign state. They are called the host nation, and the host nation is responsible for allowing troops that are visiting to go off and guest troops, I suppose, to go and do things. And I can understand in Macedonia, they don't want to have a refugee camp on the border, as Keith Graves was saying. That will be a real problem.
Okay, a warm welcome to you. First of all, are these reports about the collapse of the KLA, have they any truth in them?
No. Mostly they're just analyses. At the moment KLA is not nearby the collapse. They're using only defensive methods now, knowing that, for example, in the Renica area and in Lap area, which is now a stronghold of KLA, about nearly 100,000, 150,000 civilians. So they have to do all what they can to protect them, so to use only defensive methods. If it will come that KLA will see that they need to go in real guerrilla war, so going behind the Serbian lines, then we will see that KLA is not near the collapse.
You're implying that resolve is still as strong, that morale is high, but what about these reports of fuel and ammunition being low? As this has been going on now for such a long time, surely this in part must be true.
That is in part true, because since the Rambouillet Accord, we ceased all our activities on waiting that Milosevic will come to sign this document, and respecting what we actually sign it, that our activities will be low-leveled, and in respect of airstrike, not to use airstrike or to attack the Serbs. But I'm afraid that every day is coming much harder for KLA, keeping this ceasefire, I can say.
Have the KLA lost faith in the NATO airstrikes? Did they presume that they would have a greater effect far sooner?
No, we know that at least this last 2-3 days, that for NATO was very hard to go actually effectively in the second phase, attacking the artillery pieces and the tanks because of the weather. And we trusted them a lot, knowing that and looking even politically that the NATO is determined to go until the end, until the destruction of all Serbian units who are doing this genocide. Despite
saying that, I understand there have been calls for more people to come forward to join the KLA to be trained.
Yeah, now the first time the KLA has issued an order. All the males from 17 to 15 years old have to go to the KLA commands and to start training. Actually, it's a general mobilization, which we can say that it's the last days that KLA will still be in this shape, staying in their position and waiting for NATO, what is happening. It's overwhelming response to this. We have reports that there are nearly 25,000 people already in the areas outside Kosovo who are waiting and training, and will be very soon another response.
So these reports, you deny that they are facing collapse. Thank you very much for that. Plura Seydiu, thank you.
You're welcome.
One more now on the trial today of those 3 Americans.
In an explosion of yellow ribbons and American flags, the war in the Balkans came to East LA today, to the street where Sergeant Andrew Ramirez grew up, and now everybody's worried about the kid they call Andy. His Uncle Frank spoke for the family.
Well, I feel bad. You know, it's like you say, you know, it's like a death in the family, really, because we don't know if he's going to come out.
In rural Capac, Michigan, the battered face of Sergeant Chris Stone stared out from the morning paper, a shocking change from the playful kid at the high school where prayers were posted in black and white today. And his running coach, Ken Marzga, said the Serbs just got themselves a handful.
When push came to shove, he got tougher and tougher. So I can't picture him give up anything up to those guys, nothing.
At Fort Sam Houston in Texas, where Stone's wife and 4-year-old son live, his mother-in-law said the family's doing all right.
Your expressions of concern for Chris and Tricia and their little boy Ryan are especially heartwarming.
And in Huntsville, Texas, the parents of 21-year-old Stephen Gonzalez said the TV images of their son were cause for hope and anxiety.
Yeah, it's a bittersweet relief. You see him, that he's alive and blinking his eyes, but yet, you know, don't know what's going to happen.
Rosie Gonzalez said her son and the others were just doing their duty.
Stephen and these other 2 soldiers are not criminals, and they should not be dealt with as criminals.
Back in East L.A. in Andy Ramirez's old neighborhood, Dolores Sanchez was handing out more American flags.
This way he'll know that we are supporting him, that we want him back, and this is a country of freedom.
And they already have an idea how to get Andy and the others home. Uncle Frank's idea.
You know, if they don't give him up, go in. You know, if we got the power over there, and we're supposed to be the strongest country in the world, why shouldn't we?
A little more than a week ago, President Clinton urged Americans to look at a map to learn where this war is being waged. In East L.A. and K-Pac, Michigan, and Huntsville, Texas, they don't have to look very far. It's at their doorsteps.
We're watching Sky News today after continuing to bomb its bases.
Aircraft laden with humanitarian aid are flying to the Balkans. Oxfam has sent 2 huge cargo planes to Macedonia and to Albania, which is struggling to cope with more than 100,000 refugees.
We have a series of reports from our team of correspondents covering the crisis from around the world.
An estimated 15,000 refugees, many from the Kosovan capital Pristina, have gathered on the Macedonian border. They've been forced from their home by armed Serbs and sent here by the trainload. Aid agencies have managed to give them water and some bread, but little else. Macedonia, one of Europe's poorest countries, can't cope with such an influx. Armed soldiers have been trying to keep the desperate crowds back. Meanwhile,
President Đukanović, by a man of his own choosing. Although I cannot give you the details today, I can say that we have evidence to show that he is preparing a coup against Montenegro to replace President Đukanović.
in the United States, President Clinton is spending Good Friday locked in talks on the crisis with security advisors. He's already issued a blunt warning to Milosevic over the captured US soldiers, telling him the United States takes care of its own. Washington says the Serbs have no legal right to put the 3 on trial. NATO's military campaign against the Serbs is being strengthened by the day. American B-1B bombers are back at RAF Fairford after another night of air raids, and 12 more stealth bombers have joined existing forces. Mark Smith, Sky News.
Well, Keith Graves joins us now live from the Macedonian border town of Blace. Keith, very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Simon.
Keith, horrifying scenes that we're witnessing now right where you are, and they are only going to get worse, aren't they?
They are indeed. Horrifying is a word that comes to mind. It's difficult to believe that this is Europe in 1999. We've used the word overwhelming a lot this week, but it is overwhelming. This is overwhelming the Macedonian government, it's overwhelming the aid agencies, and to stand here and see this really is overwhelming for those of us who are here. There are, if you can see behind me, there's a line of buses. Those buses are ferrying, there are about 100 being used to ferry refugees into the camps in town. But over the top of the buses, if you can see them, there is down there a field which is the end of the line for the people who are being shipped out, forced out by the Serbs on the trains. That's at the side of the railway line. In that field at the moment, and it's a wet, boggy field, it's been raining here today, there are about 20,000 people, and some of them have been there now for 30 hours. There's no proper sanitation, it's very cold here at night. They are getting a certain amount of food and water, but the aid agencies are not down there amongst them, and I think that's probably because the aid agencies are being overwhelmed as well. The conditions down there are really quite appalling. And another frightening thing to tell you is that the other side, where you can't see, on the other side of the border, we're told there are at least 100,000 people on the move. They're being stripped of everything they possess, put on the railway line, and ordered at gunpoint to march down the railway line, and they're being told that if they step off the railway line, there are minefields either side. So the word overwhelming, as I say, comes to mind. It covers this tragedy here.
The word misery too. You've spoken to them. We've seen in previous conflicts that gets to the stage where life is not worth living in this area, so they decide to return to the very problem that drove them away in the first place. Do you think that's possible in the next few days?
Absolutely, yes. Some of the stories are quite horrifying. I was told just now, I was talking to a colleague up here who was talking to somebody he knew had come over, and this man, they knocked on the door of his house in Pristina, the Serbs, and they said, you're leaving now, immediately. And he and his sister were standing there, and they said, but your sister will leave tomorrow, she will spend the night with us. He managed to persuade them that they should let his sister leave. But that's the sort of thing that's happening to these people, so that when they arrive here, as Ross Appleyard was telling you from the Albanian border earlier in the morning, they have absolutely nothing. Some of them have got one bag with a blanket in maybe, but they're being stripped of everything they possess. They're not just being told leave, they're being stripped of everything they possess, not just their dignity, but also any document that can prove their identity. And so it's taking the authorities here 15 minutes to process each person. They're standing down there in a long line. It's just starting to rain again. It's cold here. Next 2 or 3 hours, when darkness falls, it'll be bitterly cold here. And most of those people down there are going to spend yet another night in the open. There are no tents even down there for them.
Keith Graves from Macedonia, thank you very much.
And now with the American...
The border. Last night, about 10,000 Kosovars entered the country. Aid agencies expect a further 60,000 to arrive over the next few days. The influx is putting a huge strain on Albania, the poorest country in Europe. Sky's Ross Appleyard is there. He reports on efforts to ease the humanitarian crisis.
Ethnic cleansing knows no boundaries. Old and young shepherded across the border like cattle. Few possessions, little money, and little hope for the future.
Si ke emrin ti?
Behare.
Behare, nga po vjen ti Behare?
Nga Zymi.
Ha?
Nga Zymi.
Nga Zymja? Çka ka ndodhur me ty Xhaxhi?
Ne kanë përzorë në shtëria të shtëpive.
The last word of the Serbian police has been you had wanted to be in Great Albania, so you go straight to Great Albania and forget about Kosovo.
The stream of people flooding into Albania from Kosovo has not let up. If anything, it's increased. And the stories they have to tell are horrific. Those stories are of killing, burning, and brutality.
She's telling his story. She's blonde. She couldn't see, and had been forced out by police, and the rest of her family is in the other direction, and she had been took by police and put in the street side.
One man collapsed as soon as he crossed the border, the relief of reaching safety proving too much.
Will it be okay?
Yeah, sure. She needs rest.
Some are defiant, determined that their spirit will not be broken, but it's difficult to see how they can rebuild their lives in a country which is doing its best, but has no chance of coping with the huge numbers of refugees crossing the border. Ross Appleyard, Sky News, on the Kosovan-Albanian border.
Russia has dispatched a state-of-the-art reconnaissance ship to the Mediterranean with orders to monitor NATO transmissions. Moscow has threatened to pass any sensitive information it intercepts to Belgrade. The Russians have boosted their Black Sea flotilla, although they're still pushing for a diplomatic resolution.
On course from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the reconnaissance ship Liman, symbolic gesture of Russia's defiance of NATO. The Defense Ministry claims she carries state-of-the-art monitoring technology and explained the lack of weapons as proof of her suitability for the job. But also in Sevastopol, there was no mistaking the hardware being loaded onto other naval ships. Russia has cleared passage for up to 7 through the Bosporus Channel, should the government decide to beef up its flotilla. A so far unfulfilled gesture to match the heated public rhetoric raging in Moscow.
Don't look at the negative signals. It's not a signal. One ship does not add too much to the armada that is already there. But we send a positive signal about Belgrade ready to negotiate, and it is not given as much attention as to one ship.
On Russian television news, Kosovo dominates, but the focus is bomb damage in Belgrade and Serb protest. 6 days into the humanitarian crisis, there is little mention of refugees. Leaders of the CIS, countries that made up the former Soviet Union, held their summit today. There was rounded condemnation of NATO and no doubt at least public indignation that Boris Yeltsin's appeal for a G8 summit has been ignored by the West. Pickets again outside the British Embassy and others, but the authorities are clearly ready for more than just these few protesters. Still, contrary to previous crises, the normally bullish military has remained surprisingly restrained, leaving foreign ministry officials to vent most of Russia's anger at the West. Another signal of sorts that Russia still prefers diplomatic involvement over getting sucked into any conflict. Andrew Wilson, Sky News in Moscow.
Well, the defence analyst Francis Chusa joins us now. Francis, once again, the weather is playing a major part in this whole airstrike.
Again, we've had almost apologetic MOD officials saying, sorry guys, we went out, we had a look, nothing doing. Again, it is worth pointing out, if you were to look at the strikes the previous night, Americans were held back, the French were held back, everyone.
OK, let's go straight to Brussels. The NATO news conference is underway.
Then, in the usual manner, I'll give you the political update, and then we'll have a good period for your questions. So, David, please, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid you've got the B team again today. As Saka reiterated yesterday, NATO continues with its responsive and adaptable air operation against the military forces and structure of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. This will intensify the degradation of strategic targets and fry forces in Kosovo, despite the risks. The Fry Army and Special Police are already paying a heavy price for their campaign of terror and crimes against humanity in Kosovo. In Kosovo, as you can see on the ground activity slide, the Yugoslav Army and MUP continue to press their offensive in the Maleševo and Pagaruša region, while continuing to mop up in other areas. However, the UČK has not been defeated. They continue to gather recruits and regroup and regenerate in preparation to re-enter their struggle. Serb paramilitaries, locally raised militias, continue to terrorize ethnic Albanians and take advantage of the situation to loot and pillage. We have some before and after pictures of houses in Kosovo giving evidence of their destruction. This is by Fry forces of ethnic Albanian property. As you can see from the slide, whereas their previous actions were scattered through Kosovo, the results of their brutal activity has now produced a single large triangular area of ethnic cleansing operations. Our first series of images shows the homes in the city of Jakovica in southwest Kosovo. The first shows the houses as they were prior to Serb security force action. The second follows action. And if you can see from the slide and look at the roofs, there is definite and precise degradation and destruction of those buildings. As I told you earlier this week, and as a result of our attacks when not engaged in their offensive operations, the Fry military are going to great lengths to conceal their tanks and artillery pieces. In many cases, they are taking up positions in deserted villages and towns. This cat and mouse activity is causing them to use up critical fuel supplies. We know that one battle group of the 549th Motorized Brigade was yesterday immobilized in the vicinity of Jakovica, awaiting fuel. Therefore, NATO air-to-ground operations against fielded forces in Kosovo are already degrading and disrupting the Fry's military ability to deploy their armor. It is becoming increasingly clear that President Milosevic, having ethnically cleansed large areas, is now driving the enormous number of refugees south and west to destabilize neighboring countries such as Albania and Macedonia. But I will leave Jamie to cover these humanitarian issues in more detail. Our flexibility and adaptability to meet this challenging scenario expands daily. We will continue to mount our operations with untiring resolve and increasing effectiveness.
David, thank you very much for the operational update. The NATO ambassadors met this morning, as they've met every day throughout this crisis, and their foremost concern remains with the forced depopulation of Kosovo, which continues unabated. Indeed, yesterday, 36,500 Kosovars were forced to leave, and that compared with 21,000 on Wednesday. At the moment, we see a 10-kilometer queue of people at the border with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. That's about 25,000 people who are stacked up, waiting to be able to leave. Many of them have died in that queue, and others have had to cross a minefield in order to get there. In fact, we now know, we see that refugees are being herded into trucks, buses, trains, to get them out as quickly as possible. In many cases, there's clear evidence of a hasty departure. We see families with very little luggage, ladies in slippers, children with no shoes or socks. And often we have reports that they have had to hand over their life savings to the Serb security forces in order to be finally able to leave, thereby depriving them of the means, albeit limited, to even begin to build some kind of new life as refugees in the neighbouring countries. This is an extortion racket which I would describe as institutionalised gangsterism. The refugee situation in the neighbouring countries is extremely grave and is becoming graver by the hour. We have now 17,500 that are in the process of entering the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, extra 14,500 in Albania in the last 24 hours, and 7,000 into Montenegro. In fact, the latest estimates that we have are that the number of internally displaced persons, in other words, those people who are not living where they used to live before this terrible conflict began, is now upwards of 634,000. In other words, it's reached 1/3 of the pre-conflict population of Kosovo. At the same time, we are extremely worried about what has happened to the men. Will the authorities in Belgrade please tell us, where are all of the Kosovar Albanian men between the ages of 16 and 60? We have reports of them being herded into stadiums and